Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Usually terrific, especially when I'm being hosted by a kid from Nyakajeme near the great Mokobore High School.
Oh, thank you, Shaka. A warm welcome to you. All our Facebook followers are watching us live here in Washington. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask some pertinent questions. Today we'll be talking about so many issues, but let's start in Burundi. Something recently happened in Burundi, something that is closer to Voice of America, closer to BBC World. The government shut down Voice of America operations and BBC operations in Burundi. Your reactions?
Well, of course, as a journalist and as obviously someone that cares very much about that particular region, and as someone, frankly, that likes to cover a story from out of Burundi, Bujumbura, the capital and stuff like that, I am very, very disappointed. Because let's face it, I honestly do not know why the authorities decided to take that measure. Because let's face it, I know that we have a referendum around the corner, but to be honest with you, the information I have about what happens or doesn't happen in that republic, under normal circumstances, frankly, Pierre Nkurunziza should have nothing to fear. Because the ruling party, the CNDD, FDD, let's face it, it's pretty much very supported by a lot of people. So I really don't know why they don't want us to cover what is going on.
What could be the president of Burundi hiding? What is it? This whole thing happened just days after we had celebrated World Press Freedom Day. And there are a lot of people who say that it could be as a result of what's coming up maybe in about a week's time, the upcoming referendum that is essentially going to maybe give him more time in office.
There is, of course, the upcoming referendum, as I, earlier on kind of like alluded to that point. But let's face it, yes, the referendum, in fact, is coming up, I think, next week on May 17th. To be honest with you, I don't think that there is any doubt as to who, in fact, at the end of the day, is going to win the referendum. What is happening in Burundi is not particularly unique to that particular country. That is something that you basically pretty much associate with countries that are democratically challenged. He happens to be in the Great Lakes region. When you look at the neighbors themselves, they have pretty much been there. They also, in fact, in the process of going there, have not necessarily acted as people who feel that, they are being covered objectively and what have you. So it's about democracy or the lack of it, So, that's what I can see, really. But otherwise, ideally, like I said, I honestly do not see who can, in fact, challenge or stop what the ruling party, wants to have, which is, of course, removing the term limits, opening up the space, which is the same thing in Rwanda, the same thing in Uganda, which is the same thing in a country like the Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, in Chad, and you name it. It seems to me that for some strange reason, when you look at democracy in the context of Africa, we seem to be going backwards rather than forwards.
Shaka, in the past, you've defended Burundi, the constitution, especially in Burundi, saying that they have one of the most liberal constitutions. You've defended some of the policies they have in Burundi. Do you still share the same view, especially in light of them closing Voice of America, BBC, and what could happen maybe in a week's time?
Well, yeah, man. The fact that they have a problem with some international broadcasters not doing their job as they are supposed to do doesn't necessarily take away from the kind of constitution that Burundi has. Let's face it, Burundi's constitution is pretty much like a replica of the South African constitution. One thing I like about it is that you're not talking about winner takes it all. You have proportional representation in Burundi, and frankly, that is something that I would like to see across the entire continent. So yes, I still defend the fact that they have an incredibly good constitution. They also have a democratic right, by the way, of amending the constitution, because mind you, let's face it, Paul, a constitution is not a sort of document that is not supposed to be dealt with. It is considered to be, in terms of law, I never went to law school, but in terms of law, it is called a living document. And therefore, it is subject to amendments. It is not a sacrosanct sort of piece of document.
Let's cross over to Uganda. We have a lot of news happening as we speak. The government took, I guess, a unilateral decision to import doctors from Cuba. In fact, we are not only talking about Uganda. Kenya seems to be on the verge of doing this as a result of maybe trying to show these doctors who have been striking for more wages that they can actually override their demands and go ahead and import Cuban doctors. Your thoughts on that?
It is very unfortunate, sincerely, because, you know, these leaders, and you're talking about, when you're talking about Uganda, you're talking about the government, you're really talking about Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. He actually issued that statement when he was in a place called Sembavule, where people like the foreign minister, Sam Kutesa, in fact, hail from, and where people like General Sejusa comes from. It was during, I think, Labor Day. And he said that he is actually going to import Cuban doctors so that they can actually come and provide service that is badly needed, for the most part, in rural Uganda. And yet, it's not really because there are no doctors in Uganda. Rather, the problem is that the Ugandan government has not actually been able to meet the basic demands of the healthcare workers. When you look at how much a Ugandan doctor really earns, you can't believe this is someone that goes to Makerere, spends 5 years, you know, trying to become a doctor, spends there as an intern and all that kind of stuff. And yet, when you look at the salary that a Ugandan doctor earns, it's much less, in fact, than a member of parliament. It's much less than a senior military officer. It's much less than anybody you can think about. In fact, in some cases, I have seen situations where drivers who are working for certain parastatals actually earn more than a Ugandan doctor. So when you think about it sincerely, I think the government is honestly becoming very unreasonable and very insensitive, because if anything, they should be coming up with some kind of incentives, really, to make sure that at least they increase the doctors and nurses' remuneration and all that kind of stuff, improve their quality of, you know, welfare, provide them with some necessary tools that they need in order for them to actually do what they are expected to do. But this thing of saying that they're like the enemies of the people and what have you, without frankly meeting their basic needs, I would like President Yoweri Museveni to put himself in the shoes of a doctor in Uganda, and then we can talk.
But in fairness to President Yoweri Museveni, he has said that actually he takes a lower salary. For example, he has said that when you look at it in terms of dollars, it's about $600 that he's paid monthly to meet his living expenses.
You know, I don't honestly know whether he's serious. There's no question that when you look at the figures in terms of the salary that he earns, yeah, it is still much greater than the doctor, but it's not a very big deal if you compare him probably with the president somewhere else. But again, when you are a president of a country, and you are a president of a country that is democratically challenged, whereby, as a matter of fact, you can decide to do anything, as in fact Yoweri Museveni does. Talking like that, frankly, is an insult to the intelligence of Ugandan people. And I think, frankly, it is also the height of arrogance. Because let's face it, this man is essentially like a prince. The man lives off the backs of the average taxpayer to the extent that he has a presidential jet to boot. He can wake up and decide that he wants to go to Cairo, and he's in Cairo. He can decide to wake up and say he wants to go to Moscow, and he's in Moscow. And when he's there, he's staying in a 5-star or even greater hotel. And guess who pays for that bill? It's the average taxpayer. His clothes, his food, his rent, you name it. So to be honest with you, it is very, very, I think, unconscionable for any leader to talk like that. Now, when you talk about bringing Cuban doctors, you're actually even talking about paying them much more than your own daughters and sons who happen to be doctors or nurses. So why can't you pay your own people? Maybe we should actually reach a point where we should actually look for someone else from Cuba to come and become president of Uganda. Or become the commander-in-chief of the Uganda Army and Uganda Air Force and all that kind of stuff. Guess what? If that were to happen, he probably wouldn't end up looking like a presidential monarch. And when you go to Kenya, it is very unfortunate that a man like Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, well, his country is also equally democratically challenged, but certainly not in the same democratic league like Uganda. He should at least be able to consult with some of these doctors, these healthcare workers, before you actually come to a decision to import Cuban doctors wherever. Can you imagine? Cuba is a very small island. We're talking about 10 million people. Cuba consciously trains healthcare workers in order for these people to actually be deployed outside of Cuba so they can earn a living in a way that they can contribute to the development of their own nation. When you talk about a country like Uganda, you look at Makerere Medical School. This is an institution that actually was in place even before Aisha Kasari was born. And yet, as I told you some time back, I am not that very young because I am a beneficiary of the Gutenberg factor, the printing press. Unlike you, who happen to be the beneficiary, of course, of the latest, technology, the latest social media and all that kind of stuff. So it's most unfortunate.
Shaka, you are watching Shaka Extra Time live from Washington, D.C. Let's go back to our Facebook comments. Let's go to South Sudan. It says the plight of doctors is not just about in Uganda. For example, in South Sudan, doctors make about $25 a month. Your reaction, especially in light of what's going on in South Sudan. You now have two vice presidents who are all fighting for power. The story of South Sudan never ends.
Again, it is very unconscionable, really, because let's face it, why should a doctor in Southern Sudan really earn that kind of figure? And let's face it, does that doctor in fact live off that? Of course, the answer is not. You see, you have a situation where if a government or a company pretends, for example, to pay somebody, that somebody will also pretend to work for you in return. They'll have to look for some alternatives around the problem, so that in fact at the end of the day, these doctors probably end up, looking at the kind of drugs that are available for patients, and probably take those drugs, sell them in their own quote-unquote private clinics. This is why it's very unfortunate that you have a situation like in a lot of African countries, they try to give the impression that anybody can actually go to a hospital or a dispensary and you don't have to worry about drugs because the government is supposed to provide them. But guess what? Because you do not pay doctors, at least enough for them to provide for their families and what have you, the doctors also pretend to work. So they end up looking at some of these resources and abuse them. And so it's very unfortunate that any government, frankly, or at least a responsible government, can put its most professional, most educated cadres in that condition, in that context. It's very unfortunate. This is where, because of being democratically challenged, and because some of these countries like Southern Sudan, they actually came to power through AK-47. They only care about the military institution, the security services, because those services, those soldiers, those intelligence people and what have you, help to keep them in power. They don't probably even care sincerely about the ordinary person or the ordinary folk.
Shaka, very briefly, what's at stake in South Sudan now that we have a vice president who was part of the opposition allying with the current president? Does that mean that this is it? The opposition SPLM in opposition has formally been accepted to work with the government?
You know, I think right from the beginning, when you look at the IGAD deal, which was supported by IGAD Plus, and I'm talking about the United States, Britain, and Norway, and all kind of stuff, I think it just did not work. It can't work if you can't have Dr. Riek Machar in Juba doing what he was supposed to do, which is becoming the first vice president of that government, and given the kind of supporter that he commands, it just didn't work. I think the reason you had a man like General Tabandeng Guy, who really has demonstrated, frankly, that he does not actually have following, or at least sufficient following, in order for his group, which was supposed to be SPLA in opposition, SPLA-IO, working together with the SPLA in government, IG, which is headed by Salva Kiir Mayardit. I think all along there was no deal really. If you thought that it was a deal, it simply reminds me of a situation, Paul, where you have a couple planning a marriage while concentrating on divorce.
Interesting. Shaka, last week we talked about something that keeps coming up. There was one Frank Nwamanya who asked what accomplishments can Africa pride itself in the last two decades. But I wanted maybe to ask a similar question in a different way. What are some of the most important contributions Africans can pride themselves in the last 2 decades?
You know, that is obviously much, shorter than the last time I happened to be a resident of, of Africa. But I can tell you, by the time I left, and many years even when I was in universities and what have you here in America, there was the issue of communication, and especially we're talking about the telephones. You had these landlines. There were very few landlines across the African continent. As a matter of fact, I recall that when Bill Clinton was president of the United States of America, and he went, and I think, on a 10-day, kind of like tour of Africa back in I believe it was 1998. Most of the telephone lines, when you looked at the survey, they were pretty much found in South Africa. They were pretty much found in Egypt. So most of the continent, frankly, could not communicate. But when you think about the cell phone, you can't believe it. I mean, almost everybody, even people who actually are like quote-unquote cowboys, who had cows cattle, who look after goats and sheep and what have you, somewhere in the hills of Chigezi and what have you, you can't believe they have a cell phone. Almost everybody can communicate. So I think that is a great contribution, frankly, so far, at least in the last 20 years or so. You also have, in fact, some innovations, especially in Kenya, like M-Pesa. You're talking about a sort of digital telephone bank. You know, people can actually send money, forward money here and there, and a lot of things. So I think communication is much better, much greater, and I think that really contributes to what should be, which is the development of the continent.
Let's go to another comment here. Let's go to Chinedu Omeji. Shaka, talk about Nigerian political developments. Earlier we talked about how the government soldiers today were able to rescue about 1,000 people who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. You could also maybe talk about the president going for another medical treatment in London.
Well, first of all, the issue of 1,000 people being rescued in northeastern Nigeria, we're talking about the areas that, you know, where there are these operations against Boko Haram and what have you, would, if true, would be a great, in fact, a huge development. There's no question about it. Yeah. The problem is that, at least so far, apart from the report I saw on Reuters, which was also quoting an email sent by the Nigerian military, I have not seen any other sources corroborating that particular information. Could it be that perhaps they did it? Like I said, if they did it, that is huge. If on the other hand, it's a public relations stunt, like a sort of red herring, a diversionary, especially given that you have President Muhammadu Buhari going to London to meet with his doctor again for the next 4 days. That's the kind of Twitter he sent out, that he will be back, or at least he expects to be back in Abuja, the capital, on Saturday. Then probably there is a possibility that they were trying to dilute the headline, to try to have a story that somehow helps you to focus on it rather than look at the issue of President Muhammadu Buhari. Because let's face it, he was in Washington last week. He left on a Tuesday. He has a presidential jet. But guess what? They had to go through London, supposedly for aircraft servicing and what have you. And in the process, he actually had to go and meet his doctor. And so probably when they met, it's quite possible that the doctor might have really suggested that, Mr. President, maybe you should come back. There is something that we have to look at again. Mind you, this is about almost election time, because President Buhari has already indicated that he is going to be seeking a second term. And you know the elections are around April next year. This is June, my brother. Pretty soon, election mode.
Yeah. Shaka, let's maybe go back to the Horn of Africa. I was reading something in the Washington Post and I came across an article that sort of said that if you're under the new leadership in Ethiopia, Ethiopians are embracing change. They've been going through so much with protesters rallying almost every other day, and now finally they have somebody from the opposition who they can rally behind. Your sense of where Ethiopia is going politically?
First of all, let's correct this. It's not from the opposition. It is a new kid on the block who happens to come from the ruling party, which is...
I meant opposition stronghold.
Yes.
The Oromia. Yeah.
Well, the Oromia. But the Oromia, this guy, first of all, you're talking about the new prime minister and the chairman of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. You're talking about Abiy Ahmed. He is a former Lieutenant General. He's a former quote-unquote freedom fighter. He's a former key senior intelligence official. He's one of really the ruling elite, but happens to come from a group known as the Oromo, who are the numerically most significant community in Ethiopia. And in fact, they also probably are the most visible people in Addis Ababa, you know, that kind of stuff. It also happens to be, I think, the richest or better off economically. There is no question that he does have support. For the first time, you have a leader who comes from at least a community that is obviously very supportive of somebody who is in power. And so it could probably make a difference. Mind you, until recently, or at least before Mrs. Zenawi died, coming from Tigray, and these are the guys who actually seized the power back in 1991, they just form 6% of the population. And you're talking about a country that has more than 105 million human beings, the second largest country on the continent after Nigeria. Well, it so happens that this man is saying the right things. He's talking about looking at the opposition as not enemies, but competitors, and legitimate competitors. He's talking about pretty soon ending the state of emergency and all that kind of stuff, and he wants the media to have unfettered access to freedom so they can do their job. It looks like a good thing. You could very well probably have a significant socio-economic political change around the corner in Ethiopia.
Very briefly, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we're going to be talking about the golden political handshake between Kenyan President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, and former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga. Is this golden political kind of like handshake really? Does it in fact mean something? If so, what are the implications? Because let's face it, so far, it seems to be on the right track. When they actually shook hands, the shilling went up against the dollar and what have you. And so far, a lot of people tell you they are enjoying very unusual periods or times of peace and stability.
In 30 seconds, there are people who say it hasn't worked, it was just a photo op.
Well, of course, there is incontrovertible evidence to dispute that. But of course, we don't know what this one is very temporary. We don't know whether it can be sustained. I think the question is, can we in fact be patient enough to see what happens? Because the two have formed a team of 14 people who are supposed to come and meet and come up with some recommendations.
Well, Shaka, on that note, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure having you around.
You're most welcome.
Thanks for your insight, and I look forward to another edition of Shaka Extra Time next week. To you, all our viewers, we say thank you and keep those comments coming. Until then, so long from Washington.